December 16th, 1944. A German staff car rolls through freezing fog in the Ardennes forest. Inside, 3 Wehrmacht intelligence officers study captured American supply reports. One of them laughs out loud. He taps the paper with his gloved finger and says to his companions, "They are finished. Look at these numbers. Patton's Third Army has ammunition for 3 more days, maybe 4 if they ration carefully." His colleagues nod. The math is simple. The Americans have raced across France so fast, their supply lines snapped like overstretched rubber bands. Every calculation confirms it. The Allies cannot possibly feed their advance anymore. In 72 hours, maybe 96, the American guns will fall silent. The panzers will cut through starving, immobilized divisions like a knife through warm butter. By Christmas, the war turns. But something happened that these officers never saw coming. Something that would make their confident laughter echo like a bitter joke through history. 6,000 trucks appeared out of nowhere and kept rolling until every German hope shattered against an endless stream of shells and gasoline that logically should not have existed. The convoy had a name, Red Ball Express, and it became the invisible weapon that killed Hitler's last gamble. What do you think decided the Battle of the Bulge? Was it Patton's tactical genius, the bravery of surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne, or something else entirely? Write your answer in the comments. The story you are about to hear exists in a strange shadow zone of military history. Everyone knows the names: Bastogne, Patton's relief column, the desperate stand of the 101st Airborne. But almost nobody asks the question that matters most. How did Patton's tanks keep moving when German high command had calculated down to the last gallon that they should have been dead in the snow? The answer was systematically buried, not through malice exactly, more through indifference. The men who made it possible were not supposed to matter. They drove trucks, inglorious work. Even less glorious, most of them were black soldiers in a segregated army that did not want to tell their story. For decades, the official histories mentioned the Red Ball Express in a footnote, maybe 2 paragraphs. A logistics operation, efficient, nothing more. But declassified Wehrmacht planning documents tell a different story. They reveal something that makes your skin crawl when you understand the implications. The Germans lost the Battle of the Bulge before the first shot was fired. They lost it to an enemy they never even knew they were fighting. Walk with me into a room that technically does not exist anymore. A basement archive in a former Gestapo building in Berlin, now converted into a museum. In 1997, during renovation work, construction crews broke through a false wall. Behind it, they found filing cabinets that had been sealed since April 1945. Inside those cabinets, operational assessments prepared by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Logistics Division. Hundreds of pages analyzing Allied supply capacity. The documents were meticulous. German military efficiency at its finest. They tracked everything: fuel consumption rates per vehicle type, average tonnage delivered per convoy, road capacity calculations, weather impact projections, and every single page came to the same conclusion. By mid-December 1944, the Allied advance would starve itself to death. One report stands out. It was written by General Major Rudolf Hoffmann, Chief of Transport Analysis for the Western Front. The date, November 28, 1944. 18 days before the Ardennes offensive began. Hoffmann had built his career on logistics. He understood supply chains the way a watchmaker understands gears. His assessment ran 43 pages. I will give you the core conclusion, translated from the original German. The Anglo-American forces have achieved tactical mobility unprecedented in military history. However, this mobility has created a logistical crisis from which they cannot recover before spring 1945. Their supply lines now stretch from Normandy beaches to the German border, a distance of more than 400 miles. The French rail system remains substantially destroyed by our demolitions and Allied bombing. Therefore, the enemy depends entirely on road transport. Our intelligence confirms they possess approximately 8,000 operational trucks assigned to forward supply duties, accounting for maintenance cycles, driver fatigue, fuel consumption for the trucks themselves, and the primitive condition of available roads. We calculate maximum sustainable delivery capacity at 45,000 tons per day. Current Allied consumption exceeds 70,000 tons per day. This deficit is unsustainable. By December 15th, forward units will begin experiencing critical ammunition shortages. By December 25th, offensive operations will become impossible. Recommendation: launch Operation Wacht am Rhein between December 15th and December 20th to exploit this window of enemy weakness. Read that again. A German general correctly identified the exact window when Allied supply lines should have collapsed. He was not guessing. He was calculating based on hard intelligence. Every number in his report was accurate. 8,000 trucks, 400-mile supply line, 70,000 tons daily consumption. The math was perfect. There was just one small problem. The math was incomplete. General Hoffman's intelligence officers had identified American supply trucks operating in France. They had tracked convoy movements. They had even captured several vehicles and interrogated drivers. But they missed something huge. They counted the trucks they could see. They never imagined there might be an entirely separate supply operation running parallel to the official logistics network. An operation that moved faster, carried more, and operated under conditions the Germans believed were impossible. The Red Ball Express was not an official military designation when it started. It was a railroad term. Back in the civilian world, Red Ball meant express freight, highest priority, move it fast. Somebody in the Transportation Corps borrowed the name, and it stuck. But here is what the Germans never understood. The Express was not just a convoy, it was a revolution. It threw out every established logistics doctrine and built something new from scratch. Let me take you to August 25th, 1944. The place, a dusty field outside Cherbourg, France. The Allied breakout from Normandy has just succeeded. German forces are retreating in chaos. General Patton's Third Army is racing east so fast that his tanks are outrunning their supply trucks. Staff officers are panicking. The advance is going to stall. Patton himself is screaming at anyone in range that he needs fuel and ammunition immediately. If supply does not catch up in 48 hours, the pursuit will die and the Germans will establish new defensive lines. Everything the Allies fought for since D-Day will be wasted. In that field outside Cherbourg, a lieutenant colonel named Gordon Red Matthews stands looking at a map. Matthews is not a West Point graduate. Before the war, he managed a trucking company in Ohio. The Army grabbed him because they needed men who understood logistics. Now he has an impossible job. He must move 10,000 tons of supplies per day from the Normandy beaches to Patton's forward positions. The distance keeps growing. Right now it is 140 miles. Next week it will be 200. The official supply plan says this cannot be done. Not enough trucks. Not enough fuel for the trucks. Not enough replacement parts. Not enough of anything. Matthews looks at the map for a long time. Then he makes a decision that will change everything. He throws the official plan in the trash. Matthews calls a meeting with his officers and sergeants. Most of them are black soldiers. The Army does not trust black men with combat roles, so they end up in service units. Quartermaster companies, truck drivers, the kind of work nobody writes about in after-action reports. Matthews tells them, "Gentlemen, we are going to do something the manual says is impossible. We are going to run convoys 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no stops except for fuel and loading. Every truck will drive one-way loops. Load in Cherbourg, drive to the front, dump cargo, drive back empty, repeat. We will maintain a steady stream. The Germans have air superiority. They have saboteurs. The roads are garbage. I do not care. We drive until the wheels fall off." One of the sergeants, a man named John Jackson from Georgia, raises his hand. "Sir, the maintenance manual says we are supposed to inspect every vehicle after every trip. That takes 6 hours per truck." Matthews looks at him. "Sergeant, the manual also says we cannot win this war. Inspect while you fuel. If the engine runs and the wheels turn, it drives. Next question." That meeting established the operating doctrine that would terrify German intelligence analysts for the next 6 months. The Red Ball Express was born in that moment, not as a plan approved by headquarters, as an act of barely controlled desperation that somehow worked. Within 72 hours, the first convoys rolled, hundreds of trucks moving in continuous loops. They drove through the night without headlights because German aircraft hunted anything that showed a light. They drove through rain that turned roads into rivers of mud. They drove through towns still smoking from artillery fire hours earlier, and they delivered 10,000 tons the first week, 15,000 the second. By September, 20,000 tons per day were flowing to the front. Patton's tanks kept moving. The German retreat became a rout. But here is where the story gets strange. Here is where you start seeing the shadow that history tried to bury. Go back to those captured German intelligence reports, the ones from November and December 1944. The analysts at Wehrmacht headquarters are going crazy. They keep getting frontline reports that contradict their calculations. A forward observer reports that American artillery fired continuously for 6 hours during an assault. That should have exhausted their ammunition stockpile. Yet the next day, the same battery fires another barrage. A panzer commander reports destroying 3 American supply trucks on a road. He expects the supply line to show disruption. Instead, truck traffic actually increases. It makes no sense. The numbers do not work. One intelligence summary from December 8, 1944, includes this note: "Source reliability questioned. Reported American logistics activity exceeds theoretical maximum capacity by at least 60%. Either our baseline assumptions are incorrect or the enemy has access to supply sources we have not identified. Further investigation required." They never got the chance to investigate further. 8 days later, the Ardennes offensive began, and by then it was too late. The Battle of the Bulge opened with the kind of shock the Germans had perfected. 83,000 men and more than 400 panzers smashed into a thinly held section of American line. The weather was perfect for the attackers. Heavy fog grounded Allied aircraft. German tanks rolled through villages where American soldiers were eating breakfast. Communications collapsed. Nobody knew what was happening. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, the initial report sounded like a local counterattack. Then the scope became clear. This was not a raid. This was a full-scale offensive aimed at splitting the Allied armies in two and recapturing the port of Antwerp. If it succeeded, the war would drag on for another year, maybe longer. High-ranking officers started making very serious faces and talking in low voices about defensive lines and strategic withdrawals. But there was one man who did not think about defense. General George Patton was 90 miles south of the breakthrough when he got the news. His Third Army was in the middle of its own offensive, pushing toward the Saar River. Staff officers expected him to pause, consolidate, prepare for possible German follow-up attacks in his sector. Instead, Patton looked at the map and said something that sounded insane. "I can have 3 divisions moving north in 48 hours." His staff thought he was joking. You do not just turn an entire army 90 degrees and drive it through winter storms into the middle of a battle someone else started. The logistics alone were impossible. Patton would need ammunition for a different kind of fight. More fuel, winter equipment, medical supplies, and he would need all of it delivered not to his current positions, but to new positions he had not even reached yet. On paper, it could not be done. But Patton had something the Germans did not know about. He had the Red Ball Express. On December 20th, 1944, Patton's headquarters sent an urgent request to the Communication Zone Rear Area. The message was simple. Third Army executing emergency redeployment north. Require immediate logistic support for 3 divisions conducting winter offensive operations. Estimated ammunition requirement, 12,000 tons minimum within first 72 hours. Fuel requirement, 800,000 gallons. Destination coordinates will follow. Acknowledge receipt and confirm capability. At the receiving end, that message landed on the desk of Major James Carter, Operations Officer for the Red Ball Express Forward Depot. Carter read it twice. Then he picked up the phone and started making calls. He did not ask permission from anyone at Supreme Headquarters. He did not wait for official approval. He just started moving trucks. By midnight, the first convoys were rolling north, carrying ammunition and fuel. By dawn, the next day, supply dumps were being established at crossroads Patton's tanks had not even reached yet, and the flow never stopped. The Germans noticed something wrong almost immediately. Wehrmacht signals intelligence intercepted American radio traffic about supply movements, but could not pin down details. They knew trucks were moving. They knew supplies were flowing to the area around Bastogne, where the surrounded American airborne troops desperately needed support. But they could not figure out the source. German tactical doctrine expected supply convoys to move during daylight to avoid accidents and ambushes on unfamiliar roads. The Red Ball Express trucks moved at night. German intelligence expected supply operations to pause during heavy weather. The Express kept rolling through blizzards that reduced visibility to 0. Most confusing of all, the Germans kept destroying individual trucks and convoys. But the flow never decreased. Every time they cut one supply line, two more appeared somewhere else. It was like fighting a hydra. A Waffen SS reconnaissance report from December 22nd describes the frustration. Our interdiction efforts against enemy supply routes have achieved local success. Destroyed convoy of 12 trucks en route to Bastogne. However, road reconnaissance 3 hours later observed 30 additional trucks using parallel route 4 kilometers north. Enemy transport capacity appears unlimited. Recommend high-priority anti-logistics operations, but lack resources to implement effectively. Translation: we are killing their trucks, but it does not matter because they have too many. But it was not that they had too many trucks. It was that they were using the trucks differently. Let me explain something technical that matters enormously. Standard military logistics doctrine in 1944 called for careful management of vehicle resources. Every truck was valuable. You did not risk them unnecessarily. You certainly did not drive them continuously until they broke down. Maintenance was scheduled. Rest periods were mandatory. Safety protocols were strict. The official Army manual specified that a 2.5-ton truck should operate no more than 8 hours per day. Longer shifts caused driver fatigue and mechanical stress. After every 200 miles, a vehicle required inspection. After every 500 miles, maintenance. These rules existed for good reason. They kept equipment operational and men alive. Gordon Matthews and his drivers violated every single one of those rules every single day. Red Ball Express trucks ran 20-hour shifts. They drove until something broke, then whoever could fix it did, right there on the side of the road. Drivers slept 4 hours a day if they were lucky. There was no such thing as a maintenance schedule. You checked the oil when you stopped for fuel, and you prayed the engine kept running. Officially, this kind of operation should have led to catastrophic breakdown rates within a week. Unofficially, it worked because the men driving those trucks cared more about winning the war than following regulations. Private First Class Samuel Tucker from Detroit sits behind the wheel of a 2.5-ton GMC truck somewhere on a mud road in eastern France. The date is December 22nd, 1944. He has been driving for 19 consecutive hours. His eyes burn. His hands shake from gripping the steering wheel. The windshield wipers barely work because ice keeps forming on the blades faster than they can clear it. He cannot see more than 30 feet ahead through the snow. Behind him, stretching back into the darkness, 47 more trucks follow in a line so tight that each driver can barely see the tiny cat-eye reflectors on the tailgate ahead. No headlights. That is the rule. German fighters might be up there somewhere in the clouds, and any light draws them like moths. Tucker does not know exactly where he is going. Nobody told him a destination. They just said, drive north, follow the truck ahead, do not stop unless ordered. The cargo bay behind his seat carries 150 artillery shells packed in wooden crates, high explosive. If something goes wrong, if he hits a mine or a German patrol opens fire, he will not even hear the explosion that kills him. He thinks about this sometimes during the endless hours of driving. Mostly, he thinks about staying awake. Every Red Ball Express driver knew the same fear. The fear was not enemy action exactly. German air attacks were rare by late 1944 because the Luftwaffe was dying. Ambushes happened, but not often. The real fear was simpler and more immediate. The fear was falling asleep at the wheel and drifting off the road into a ditch, or worse, into the truck ahead. In a 70-vehicle convoy moving bumper to bumper through darkness, one mistake could kill a dozen men and destroy supplies that soldiers at the front desperately needed. So the drivers developed tricks to stay awake. Some sang songs. Some slapped themselves in the face every few minutes. Some kept the window open despite the freezing cold because the wind helped fight drowsiness. Private Tucker had his own method. He counted telephone poles. Every time the truck passed a pole, he counted it. 1, 2, 3, 4. When he reached 100, he started over. It gave his brain something to do besides shut down, hour after hour, through the night, counting poles and watching the dim red glow of the tailgate ahead. The trucks themselves were remarkable machines in their own way. The GMC CCKW, called the Jimmy by everyone who drove one, was not designed for comfort. It was designed to survive. 6-cylinder engine, 4-wheel drive, basic suspension that rattled your teeth on rough roads. Top speed maybe 45 miles per hour under perfect conditions. In reality, convoys moved at 20 to 25 miles per hour because roads were terrible and visibility was worse. But the Jimmy kept running. You could drive it through mud that swallowed a Jeep. You could nurse it along with a dying battery or a leaking radiator. Parts broke constantly, but the design was simple enough that a mechanic with basic tools could fix most problems, or a driver could fix them himself if he had to. Many did. When you are 200 miles from the nearest depot and your truck dies, you do not wait for a rescue vehicle. You crawl under the chassis with whatever tools you have, and you make it work. The men driving these trucks came from everywhere: Chicago, New Orleans, rural Alabama, Los Angeles, small towns nobody ever heard of. Most were black soldiers assigned to transportation units because that is where the segregated army put black men. A few were white drivers, but the heavy majority, roughly 75%, were African Americans. They faced two enemies: the Germans who wanted to kill them and the army system that treated them as second-class soldiers even while depending on them absolutely. They slept in segregated quarters. They ate at segregated mess halls. They could not enter certain facilities reserved for white troops. When they drove through liberated French towns, civilians cheered them as heroes and offered them wine and food and gratitude. Then they would reach a rear area American base where an officer would make them wait outside because the club or canteen was whites only. The irony was bitter enough to choke on, but they kept driving, not because they were treated well, because they understood something the Army did not want to admit. They were winning the war. Every ton of ammunition delivered, every gallon of fuel that reached Patton's tanks, every crate of medical supplies that saved a wounded soldier, that was victory. The men in the trucks knew their value even when their own command structure refused to acknowledge it. Let me tell you about one specific night that captures everything. December 23rd, 1944. The fighting around Bastogne has reached desperate intensity. The 101st Airborne Division is surrounded and running low on ammunition. Weather keeps the supply planes grounded. Nobody can drop supplies from the air. The only way in is by road, and the roads are a shooting gallery. German forces control most of the approach routes. Small American convoys trying to reach the town get chewed apart by 88mm guns and panzers. At a supply depot 30 miles south of Bastogne, Major James Carter gets a radio message from 3rd Army Headquarters. They need 500 tons of ammunition delivered to forward artillery positions supporting the relief operation. They need it delivered tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. Because at dawn, Patton's tanks are going to punch through to Bastogne, and they will need every gun firing to cover the assault. Carter does not bother explaining that moving 500 tons in one night over roads the Germans are actively shelling is impossible. He just starts organizing trucks. Sergeant John Jackson gets the assignment to lead the convoy. 40 trucks, mixed cargo, mostly 105 millimeter and 155 millimeter artillery shells, but also small arms ammunition, grenades, mortar rounds. Jackson gathers his drivers in a barn that serves as their briefing area. He does not sugarcoat the situation. Gentlemen, this is going to be bad. The route is hot. We will be driving through active fire zones. Some of you will not make it. I cannot promise you will be safe because that would be a lie. But I can promise you this. If we deliver these shells, American soldiers live through tomorrow. If we do not, they die. Your choice. Anyone who wants to sit this one out, no judgment. Nobody moves. All 40 drivers stand there waiting for orders. Jackson nods slowly. All right then, mount up. We roll in 10 minutes. The convoy leaves at 2200 hours, 10 at night, pitch dark. Snow falling so thick it looks like television static. The lead truck has Sergeant Jackson driving with a young private named Robert Lee riding shotgun. Lee is 19 years old. He has been in France for 6 weeks. This is his 4th night run. He is scared enough that his hands tremble, but he hides it well. They drive north on a road that used to be a decent 2-lane highway before the war. Now it is a scarred strip of half-frozen mud with shell craters every 100 yards. The craters are filled with ice water. Every time a truck hits one, the vehicle lurches and the driver fights to keep control. The convoy maintains tight spacing. Too tight according to doctrine, but spacing does not matter if you cannot see anyway. They navigate by following the truck ahead and occasionally checking a map by flashlight. Around midnight, they hear the first artillery. Distant thumping sounds like thunder, except it is not distant for long. As they drive closer to Bastogne, the sounds grow louder and more frequent. Bright flashes light up the horizon. The ground trembles. Then they start seeing evidence of fighting. Burned out vehicles on the roadside. A knocked out American tank, turret blown clean off. Dead animals. Once, a dead soldier lying in the ditch, frozen solid. The drivers do not talk. They focus on the road and keep moving. About 3 miles from their destination, the convoy has to pass through a small crossroads village called Remy-Champagne. Intelligence reports say the village is clear of Germans. Intelligence is wrong. The lead truck enters the village square and immediately heavy machine gun fire erupts from a building on the left. Tracer rounds cut through the darkness like bright red lines. Sergeant Jackson instinctively jerks the wheel, and the truck swerves hard. Bullets punch through the canvas covering the cargo bay. Private Lee grabs the radio handset and starts screaming for the convoy to scatter. But there is nowhere to scatter. The road is narrow and trucks are packed tight. The vehicle behind Jackson tries to reverse but hits the truck behind it. Chaos spreads down the line. More machine gun fire opens up from multiple positions. The Germans have set up an ambush at the crossroads. It is not a major force, probably just a screening detachment, but in the dark and confusion, it might as well be a panzer division. Trucks are stopped dead in a kill zone with high explosive cargo that will detonate if hit by incendiary rounds. Every driver knows exactly how bad this is, but something happens that the German ambush team does not expect. Instead of abandoning the trucks and running, the drivers fight back. Most are not carrying rifles. Transport troops get carbines at best, and half the drivers left those locked up at the depot because weapons just get in the way when you are wrestling a steering wheel for 20 hours. It does not matter. They use what they have. Some pull handguns. Others grab tire irons or entrenching tools and charge the machine gun positions in the dark. Private Lee jumps out of Jackson's truck and runs straight at the building where muzzle flashes show the machine gun location. He has his carbine. He fires from the hip while running. The German gunners shift fire toward him. Lee goes down hard, but his charge gives other drivers time to flank the position. A corporal named Willis Hayes from Tennessee throws a grenade through a window. The explosion silences one machine gun. A second gun keeps firing from a different building, but now American soldiers are inside the village, fighting room to room, and the Germans realize they are outnumbered. They retreat into the darkness. The whole engagement lasts maybe 4 minutes. Sergeant Jackson runs to where Private Lee fell. The kid is hit in the leg and shoulder. Bad but not fatal if he gets aid soon. 2 other drivers are wounded. One truck has a radiator shot to pieces and will not move. Jackson makes a fast decision. They transfer the cargo from the damaged truck onto other vehicles, cramming shells into every available space. The wounded get loaded into one truck, which will turn back to find a field hospital. The rest continue forward. By 0100 hours, they reach the artillery positions and start unloading. The gun crews are stunned to see supplies arriving. One captain actually walks up to Jackson and says, "How the hell did you get through? We were told no convoys could make the road tonight." Jackson looks at him with eyes that have not slept in 2 days and says, "Sir, nobody told us it could not be done, so we did it." That story is not a legend. It appears in multiple after-action reports and personal memoirs. The names are real. The village is real. You can find it on a map today. And versions of that story happened every single night for months. Convoys getting shot at, drivers fighting back, supplies delivered against impossible odds. But here is the truly disturbing part. Here is what makes you understand why the Germans lost. The Wehrmacht intelligence officers tracking American logistics saw these convoys. They knew trucks were getting through. They shot up many of them. But they never understood the scale. They thought they were seeing random supply movements, opportunistic runs when roads happened to be clear. They never realized they were facing a systematic, organized, relentless logistics operation that simply would not stop no matter how much you shot at it. The Red Ball Express was not a miracle. It was a deliberate choice to trade safety for speed and to accept casualties as the price of keeping the front supplied. It was brutal mathematics. If losing 3 trucks out of 50 means the other 47 deliver their cargo and American artillery has ammunition for tomorrow's battle, you accept that trade. Every time. Go back to those German planning documents. General Hoffmann's beautiful calculations about Allied logistics capacity. Every number was accurate, but the numbers measured the wrong thing. Hoffmann calculated sustainable delivery rates. He figured out how much cargo the Americans could move while keeping their trucks in good repair, their drivers well rested, their maintenance schedules followed properly. He was right about that. If the Allies followed proper logistics doctrine, their supply capacity was exactly what he calculated. But the Red Ball Express did not follow proper doctrine. It followed desperation doctrine. It followed the rule that said, we deliver supplies or our men die, so we deliver supplies. Period. No exceptions, no excuses. That willingness to burn out trucks, to drive men past exhaustion, to accept losses that made staff officers wince, that was something German logistics planning never accounted for. They could not conceive of an army that would abuse its own equipment that way. It seemed wasteful, inefficient, wrong, and it was all those things. It also won the war. By December 24th, Christmas Eve 1944, Patton's Third Army had completed its 90-degree pivot north and was hammering at the southern edge of the German salient. The attack was moving faster than anyone expected. Tanks rolled forward, infantry followed, artillery pounded German positions, and behind it all, the Red Ball Express kept the ammunition flowing. Every gun that fired, every tank that moved, every truck that carried infantry closer to Bastogne, all of it depended on that endless stream of GMC trucks driving through winter storms. The weather was horrible, temperature well below freezing, snow mixed with sleet, roads turned into ice rinks. Drivers could not feel their hands. Engines refused to start without heating the oil first. Nothing about the operation was pleasant or easy, but it worked. On December 26th, Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The 101st Airborne Division was saved. And in the chaos and celebration, almost nobody noticed the hundreds of supply trucks that had made it possible. They were just there in the background, like furniture, doing their job, not glamorous, not newsworthy, just essential. The official Army history of the Battle of the Bulge devotes exactly 3 paragraphs to logistics support. 3 paragraphs covering an operation that involved thousands of men and millions of tons of supplies moved under combat conditions. The historians who wrote that account were not trying to insult anyone. They simply did not think truck drivers were important enough to write about at length. Combat got the attention. Combat always gets the attention. But here is what they missed. Combat is meaningless without logistics. You can have the best soldiers in the world, the finest tanks, the most brilliant generals, and if you cannot feed them ammunition and fuel, they will sit in place and die. The Germans learned this lesson the hard way. By early January 1945, the Ardennes offensive was collapsing, not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because their tanks were inferior, because they ran out of fuel. Panzer divisions that should have reached the Meuse River stalled 20 miles short of their objectives because supply trucks could not get through Allied air attacks. Meanwhile, American forces never stopped moving because their supply trucks always got through. The contrast could not be more stark. One army planned a brilliant offensive based on perfect logistics assumptions and failed when reality did not match the plan. The other army threw logistics doctrine out the window and just kept delivering supplies no matter what reality threw at them. Let me show you something that captures the scale. From August 25th to November 16th, 1944, the period when the Red Ball Express operated at full capacity, it delivered approximately 412,000 tons of supplies. That number is hard to visualize, so let me put it in perspective. 412,000 tons is roughly 824 million pounds. If you loaded all that cargo onto a single train, it would stretch over 1,000 miles long. One single convoy operation moved more freight in 3 months than the entire British Army moved in 6 months during the North Africa campaign. And they did it with trucks that were supposed to be maintained carefully, driven by men who were supposed to rest 8 hours a day, on roads that were supposed to be too damaged for heavy traffic. Every assumption was wrong, every rule was broken, and it worked because the men doing it refused to fail. There is a photograph that still exists, black and white, slightly blurry, because the camera was cheap and the lighting was bad. It shows a group of drivers standing next to their trucks somewhere in France. The date stamped on the back says December 28, 1944, 2 days after Bastogne was relieved. The men are exhausted. You can see it in their faces, hollow eyes, stubble beards, uniforms caked with mud and road grime. One soldier is leaning against a fender like it is the only thing keeping him upright. Another is smoking a cigarette with hands so dirty the cigarette looks white by comparison. These are not recruiting poster soldiers. These are men who have been ground down to the bone by work that never stops. And yet every single one of them is smiling. Not big grins, small, tired smiles. The kind that says, we did something impossible and we know it. The photograph has a caption written in pencil, "Red Ball Boys after Bastogne Run, still rolling." Nobody knows who wrote it. Nobody knows who took the picture. It exists in a military archive file labeled Miscellaneous Transportation Photos. There are thousands of such files. Most have never been opened by historians. Why am I telling you about one photograph? Because it represents something larger. It represents the systematic erasure of an entire group of soldiers from the history of their own war. Think about how many World War II documentaries you have seen, how many books you have read, how many movies. Now think about how many times you heard about truck drivers. Probably never. Or if you did, it was a footnote, a quick mention. The narrative of World War II focuses on fighters and bombers, on infantry charging beaches, on tank battles in the desert, on generals moving pins on maps. All of that happened. All of that mattered. But none of it could have happened without the men who delivered the supplies. And most of those men were black soldiers who got no recognition, no medals, no parades. They came home after the war to an America that still made them sit at the back of the bus. They could drive a truck through enemy fire to save surrounded paratroopers, but they could not eat at the same lunch counter as white customers. The contradiction is obscene. Some of them tried to tell their stories. After the war, a few veterans wrote memoirs or gave interviews to local newspapers. The accounts are fragmentary and hard to find now, but they exist. One driver, a man named Charles Stevenson from Philadelphia, wrote a letter to his local paper in 1953. He was responding to an article about the Battle of the Bulge that made no mention of supply operations. His letter said, "I read your piece about Bastogne with interest. It was a good article, but it left out the most important part. It left out the trucks. Patton could not have gotten to Bastogne if we had not delivered his ammunition. His tanks would have been statues if we had not delivered his fuel. I do not expect parades or medals. I just want people to know we were there. We did our part. The war was not won only by the men who pulled triggers. It was also won by the men who made sure those triggers had bullets. The newspaper printed his letter on page 11 next to advertisements for washing machines. Most people probably never saw it, but the Germans saw the effect even if they never understood the cause. By January 1945, Wehrmacht situation reports from the Western Front show a consistent pattern. Every assessment mentions Allied logistic superiority. Every report notes that American forces never seem to run short of supplies. Commanders request more resources to attack supply lines. The requests are denied because there are no resources left. The Luftwaffe is nearly extinct. Ground forces are spread too thin, and even when German units successfully ambush Allied convoys, it makes no difference to the overall flow. One captured German officer, interviewed after the war, described it like this: "We could not understand how they did it. We destroyed their trucks. We cratered their roads. We knew they were operating at the limit of what was physically possible, but the supplies kept coming. It was like fighting an enemy who could not be exhausted. We got tired. They did not. That is when I knew we would lose." That statement cuts to the heart of everything. The Red Ball Express did not win the Battle of the Bulge through tactical brilliance. It won through sheer refusal to quit. The drivers were tired, they were cold, they were scared. Many were wounded, some died. But the trucks kept rolling. That relentless pressure, that absolute certainty that supplies would arrive no matter what, broke German strategic planning. All of Hoffmann's careful calculations, all the assumptions about Allied logistics limits, all the confidence that American forces would run out of steam, all of it shattered against the reality of 6,000 trucks that simply would not stop. It was not supposed to be possible, but nobody told the drivers it was impossible. So they made it possible. Let me take you forward briefly to see the aftermath. The Red Ball Express officially ended operations on November 16, 1944, when rail lines to the front were finally repaired enough to take over primary supply duties. But many of the same drivers and trucks continued operating under different names and organizations. During the Battle of the Bulge, they were temporarily reorganized as emergency supply units reporting directly to Third Army. After Bastogne, they supported the final push into Germany. Some drove all the way to Berlin, and then the war ended and they came home. Most received honorable discharges and a handshake. A few got commendations for specific acts of bravery, but there was no recognition of the operation as a whole, no presidential citation, no monument. For decades, the Red Ball Express existed only in the memories of men who drove the trucks and the few officers who commanded them. It was not until the 1990s that historians began seriously researching the operation and understanding its significance. Why did it take so long? Partly racism. The military establishment did not want to celebrate black soldiers when doing so might challenge segregation. Partly the nature of logistics itself. Supply work is not dramatic. It does not produce heroes in the traditional sense. There is no glory in driving a truck, and partly, I think, because acknowledging the Red Ball Express meant acknowledging that the United States Army won its greatest battles by violating its own regulations. That created uncomfortable questions. If breaking the rules worked so well in logistics, maybe the rules were wrong. Maybe a lot of established military doctrine was wrong. Nobody wanted to open that door. Easier to just not talk about it. Easier to focus on generals and battles and leave the trucks out of the story. But here is what you need to understand. What I need you to feel in your bones. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. More than 600,000 American soldiers participated. It lasted 6 weeks. It cost 19,000 American lives and tens of thousands wounded. It was brutal and desperate and terrifying, and it was won, ultimately, by truck drivers, not exclusively. Soldiers on the ground fought with incredible courage. Patton's operational decisions were sound. Air power, when the weather cleared, devastated German forces. But none of that matters if the guns have no shells. None of that matters if the tanks have no fuel. The Battle of the Bulge was won by ammunition that arrived when it should not have, by fuel that kept flowing when it should have run dry, by medical supplies that saved lives, by food that kept soldiers able to fight, all delivered by men driving GMC trucks through winter storms and German fire, men whose names history forgot. There is a document that exists in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, filed under Record Group 407, Entry 427, Box 3142. It is a German military intelligence summary dated February 8, 1945, 2 months after the Battle of the Bulge ended. The report was written by Oberst Heinrich Müller, one of the few surviving logistics analysts from the Western Front Command. Müller was trying to explain to his superiors why every offensive operation since December had failed. His report runs 71 pages, but there is one paragraph that matters more than all the others. I will translate it directly. We have fundamentally misunderstood American logistics doctrine. Our pre-invasion assessments assumed the enemy would operate supply chains according to established military principles, prioritizing equipment preservation and sustainable operational tempo. This assumption has proven catastrophically incorrect. The Americans operate their transport network at rates we consider impossible. They accept vehicle loss rates we consider unsustainable. They push drivers beyond limits we consider inhumane. And yet the system functions, more than functions. It overwhelms our capacity to interdict. We destroy 10 trucks and 20 arrive the next day. We crater a road and they drive around it within hours. We cannot defeat an enemy whose logistics operate outside rational parameters. We lack the resources to match their replacement rate, and we lack the strategic flexibility to adapt our doctrine accordingly. Recommendation: seek immediate armistice before spring offensive capabilities are lost entirely. Nobody read that report, or if they did, nobody acted on it. By February 1945, the German High Command was drowning in bad news from every front. One more report about logistics problems did not rate attention. But Oberst Müller understood something that most of his colleagues missed. He understood that Germany had not lost to superior American soldiers. Germany lost to superior American truck drivers. The Wehrmacht was still dangerous in early 1945. German troops fought with skill and determination, but they were starving for supplies. Their tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. Their artillery fell silent for lack of shells. Their wounded died for lack of medical supplies. Meanwhile, American forces advanced with full depots behind them, not because American logistics planning was brilliant, because American logistics execution refused to accept failure. Let me tell you what happened to some of the men who made that execution possible. Start with Gordon Red Matthews, the lieutenant colonel who created the Red Ball Express operating doctrine. After the war, Matthews returned to Ohio and went back to running his trucking company. He expanded the business using techniques he had learned in France. Drive hard, maintain on the move, never stop rolling. By 1955, his company was one of the largest freight carriers in the Midwest. He employed over 300 drivers. Many were veterans. Some were men who had driven for him during the war. Matthews died in 1972. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentioned his wartime service in one sentence. It said he had commanded a transportation unit in Europe. Nothing about the Red Ball Express. Nothing about the Battle of the Bulge. Nothing about the 412,000 tons of supplies his operation delivered. Just a single bland sentence about commanding a transportation unit, as if it were nothing special. Sergeant John Jackson, the man who led that convoy through the German ambush at Rhine, came home to Georgia in 1946. He tried to get a job as a truck driver with several local companies. None would hire him, not because he lacked experience. He had more experience than any civilian driver in the state. They would not hire him because he was black, and the companies had policies against hiring black drivers for long-haul routes. Jackson eventually found work at a warehouse loading trucks. Other men drove the routes. He loaded the cargo. He did that job for 23 years until his back gave out. In 1989, a local historian doing research on World War II veterans discovered Jackson's story and convinced the city to give him a commendation for his wartime service. Jackson attended the ceremony. He was 70 years old, walking with a cane because his legs never recovered from the years of hard driving and the wound he took at Rhine. The mayor gave a speech about bravery and service. They presented Jackson with a plaque. Photographers took pictures. Then everyone went home and Jackson went back to his small house on the south side of town, where he lived alone because his wife had died 3 years earlier. He kept the plaque on his mantelpiece. When he died in 1994, his nephew found boxes of letters in the attic, letters Jackson had written but never sent to the Army, to veterans organizations, to historians, all saying the same thing. We were there. We mattered. Please tell our story. Private Robert Lee, the 19-year-old who charged a German machine gun position to save his convoy, survived his wounds. He spent 4 months in a military hospital in England, then returned to duty in March 1945. He drove trucks all the way to the Elbe River. After the war, he went home to Mississippi. He used his GI Bill benefits to attend a black college and became a teacher. For 40 years, he taught history at a segregated high school in Jackson, Mississippi. He never talked about the war, not to his students, not to his family. His daughter once asked him why he kept his uniform in the closet, but never wore it or displayed his medals. He said, "Nobody wants to hear about what I did. They want to hear about Patton and Eisenhower, not about truck drivers." He was probably right. In 1998, 3 years after Robert Lee died, a documentary filmmaker making a program about the Red Ball Express tried to find veterans to interview. He located 17 men who had driven for the operation. Only 5 agreed to appear on camera. The others said they did not want attention. One told the filmmaker, "I am too old and too tired to convince people that what I did mattered. If they do not know by now, they never will." But some people did know. Some people always knew. Go talk to veterans of the infantry divisions that fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the men who held Bastogne, the soldiers who crossed the Rhine. Ask them about logistics. Ask them about supply convoys. Many will tell you flat out that they would not have survived without the trucks. There is an oral history archive at the Library of Congress with thousands of recorded interviews with World War II veterans. In those interviews, infantrymen mention the Red Ball Express more often than historians do. One paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, a man named Frank Griffin, described it this way in an interview recorded in 2003. "We were surrounded at Bastogne, cold, low on ammunition, running out of medical supplies. Every day we expected the Germans to overrun us because we could not hold without resupply. Then on December 26th, we hear engines, American trucks rolling into town under fire. They brought ammo, they brought bandages, they brought food. Those drivers saved our lives. I do not remember their names. I do not even remember their faces clearly. But I remember thinking, thank God someone got through. Thank God someone kept driving when anyone sane would have turned back." That is the testimony that matters, not the official histories written by academics decades later, not the sanitized accounts in Army manuals, the words of soldiers who were there and knew what they saw. They saw trucks arriving when trucks should not have been able to get through. They saw supplies appearing when supplies should have been exhausted. They saw proof that someone refused to let them down. And mostly, they saw black men doing the work that kept them alive while their own army treated those men as inferiors. Some of the white soldiers felt ashamed about that. Many did not think about it at all. War has a way of making people focus on survival rather than justice. But a few understood. A few recognized the cruel irony that the men most responsible for keeping the army supplied were the same men the army refused to let fight as equals. There is another layer to this story that runs even deeper, something about institutional memory and what gets preserved versus what gets erased. After World War II ended, the United States Army conducted extensive after-action reviews, thousands of reports analyzing what worked and what did not. These reports formed the basis for post-war doctrine. They shaped how the Army trained soldiers and planned operations for the next 50 years. And in those reports, the Red Ball Express is barely mentioned. Why? Because acknowledging its success meant acknowledging that established logistics doctrine was wrong. It meant admitting that the official way of doing things was not necessarily the best way. Military institutions do not like admitting they are wrong. It creates uncertainty. It invites questioning of other doctrines. Easier to treat the Red Ball Express as an emergency improvisation that worked under unique circumstances, but should not be considered a model for future operations. That is exactly what happened. The operation was classified as a wartime expedient, successful but not replicable, and therefore not worth studying in depth. This is how history gets distorted, not through malicious lies, but through passive neglect. Nobody ordered historians to ignore the Red Ball Express. Nobody censored the records. They just did not think it was important enough to warrant attention. Combat operations got priority. Strategic decisions got priority. Logistics got a footnote. And within logistics, unconventional operations that violated standard procedures got less than a footnote. They got filed away and forgotten. It was not until the 1980s and 90s when social historians started asking questions about the roles of minority soldiers in World War II that anyone bothered to dig into the archives and reconstruct what actually happened. Even then, resistance was significant. Some military historians argued that focusing on support troops distorted the narrative of how battles were won. They said combat arms deserved the attention. They were not necessarily wrong. Combat troops do deserve recognition, but so do the people who made combat possible. Both things can be true simultaneously. Let me show you a comparison that illustrates the problem. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, is one of the most famous units in American military history. Books, movies, documentaries, monuments. Everyone knows about the 1st Division. It fought with distinction in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and Germany. Approximately 16,000 men served in the division during World War II. Now consider the Red Ball Express. Approximately 6,000 drivers served in the operation during its official 3-month period. Thousands more served in the continuing operations that supported the final push into Germany. So we are talking about similar numbers of men. Both groups contributed critically to victory. But recognition is not similar. It is not even close. The 1st Division has museums dedicated to its history. The Red Ball Express has a small display in one corner of one transportation museum in Virginia. The disparity is staggering. Why does this matter now? Why am I telling you about something that happened 80 years ago? Because the pattern repeats. Every war the United States has fought since 1945 has depended on logistics. Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. In every case, victory or defeat came down to supply chains, the ability to keep forces fed, armed, fueled, and equipped. And in every case, the people doing that work get minimal recognition. We thank them for their service and then forget they exist. We build monuments to infantry and pilots. We make movies about special forces. We do not make movies about truck drivers, even though truck drivers are the reason everyone else can function. The pattern established in World War II continues. Combat gets glory, support gets forgotten, and we lose something valuable when that happens. We lose the full truth about how wars are actually won. There is a darker question lurking beneath all of this, a question that makes people uncomfortable. How much did racism contribute to the success of the Red Ball Express? Stay with me here. I am not saying racism was good. I am asking whether the Army's willingness to abuse black soldiers, to drive them past exhaustion, to accept casualty rates that would have caused outrage if white soldiers suffered them, whether that willingness was essential to making the operation work. Could the Red Ball Express have succeeded if the drivers had been white troops who could complain to congressmen and journalists? Would commanders have dared push white soldiers that hard? Or would political pressure have forced them to follow standard doctrine and accept slower delivery rates? It is a horrible thought, but it might be true. The ugly reality might be that segregation enabled a level of exploitation that won battles. The Army could burn out black drivers because those drivers had no political power and no ability to protest. And when they succeeded despite the abuse, the Army could take credit for the victory while denying the men who made it possible any recognition. If that analysis is correct, it means the United States won some of its greatest World War II victories through systemic racism, not in spite of racism, because of racism. That is a truth that does not fit comfortably in any narrative. It is too complicated, too morally ambiguous, easier to just not think about it. But we should think about it. We should sit with the discomfort, because only by understanding what really happened can we avoid repeating the same patterns. The men who drove for the Red Ball Express were heroes. Unquestionably, they saved lives, they won battles, they helped defeat Nazi Germany, and they were exploited. Both things are true. They were heroes and victims simultaneously. That duality is what makes their story so important. It refuses to be simple. It refuses to be comfortable. It demands that we acknowledge how victory is actually achieved, not through clean moral narratives, but through complicated human realities where people do extraordinary things for a cause that does not always value them. Let me take you to one final scene, a place that exists, but almost nobody visits. Arlington National Cemetery has a section dedicated to World War II veterans. Thousands of white headstones marking the graves of soldiers who served. Among those stones, scattered throughout the cemetery, are the graves of Red Ball Express drivers. They are not clustered together. They are not marked with any special designation. If you did not know to look for them, you would never find them. Just names and dates and a simple inscription. There is one stone I want you to see. Section 60, row F, stone number 37. It marks the grave of Private James Robert Washington, born 1923, died 2007. Below his name it says, World War II Transportation Corps. That is all. No mention of the Red Ball Express. No mention of the Battle of the Bulge. No mention of the convoys he drove through enemy fire. Just Transportation Corps. As if he had spent the war driving generals to meetings. Private Washington was with Sergeant Jackson's unit during the Remy-Champagne ambush. He was one of the drivers who returned fire and helped clear the German positions. After the war, he worked as a bus driver in Washington, D.C. for 40 years. He never married. He lived alone in a small apartment. When he died, the funeral was attended by 3 people: his nephew, a neighbor, and a historian who had interviewed him 2 years earlier for a book about the Red Ball Express. That historian, a woman named Dr. Patricia Cole, told me something that has stayed with me. She said Washington refused to call himself a hero. He insisted he had just done his job. She asked him if he felt the Army owed him recognition for what he did. He thought about it for a long time before answering. Then he said, "The Army does not owe me anything. I signed up. I did what I was told. But I wish people understood that wars are not won by heroes. Wars are won by people doing jobs, boring jobs, dangerous jobs, jobs nobody wants to talk about. I drove a truck. That was my job. It mattered. That is all I want people to know. It mattered. It mattered." 2 words that carry the weight of an entire hidden history. It mattered that 6,000 drivers refused to quit. It mattered that they drove through conditions that should have been impossible. It mattered that they delivered supplies when every rational calculation said they could not. It mattered that they fought back when ambushed instead of running. It mattered that they kept the front supplied during the largest battle the American Army ever fought. And it mattered that after doing all of that, they came home to a country that made them sit at the back of the bus. All of it mattered. The heroism and the injustice, the victory and the exploitation, the extraordinary achievement and the systematic erasure. You cannot separate those elements. They are woven together into a story that tells you more truth about America than any sanitized textbook. Go back one more time to those German intelligence reports. The confusion, the frustration, the growing certainty that something was wrong with their assumptions. They were looking at the Red Ball Express and seeing a logistics operation. They were seeing trucks and cargo and delivery schedules. They were not seeing what was really there. They were not seeing desperation converted into determination. They were not seeing men who had been told their entire lives that they were inferior, proving through action that they were essential. They were not seeing the power of people who have nothing to lose and everything to prove. The Germans calculated tonnage and fuel consumption. They missed the human equation entirely. They never understood that they were not fighting an enemy with better logistics. They were fighting an enemy with a different kind of will, the kind of will that comes from knowing you are not valued, but doing the work anyway because the work itself has meaning. That will broke the Wehrmacht, not Patton's tactics, not American air superiority, not even the industrial capacity of the United States, though that mattered enormously. What broke the Germans was the realization that they could not exhaust their enemy. They could not make the Americans stop. Every interdict operation failed. Every calculation proved wrong. Every confident prediction about Allied supply problems evaporated like morning fog. And at a certain point, that psychological weight becomes unbearable. You stop believing you can win. You start looking for excuses to quit. German soldiers in the Ardennes fought hard, but you can find letters and diaries from that period where they express a kind of fatalistic despair. They write things like, "We cannot beat them. There are too many. They have everything. We have nothing." That despair was not caused by American combat prowess. It was caused by American logistics, by the endless trucks, by the ammunition that never ran out, by the fuel that kept arriving, by the food that kept soldiers strong, all delivered by men whose names German intelligence never learned and whose existence German strategic planning never acknowledged. Here is what haunts me about this story. Here is what keeps me returning to it. Somewhere in Germany right now, maybe in a private archive or a family attic, there might be documents we have never seen. Personal letters from German officers, diaries, reports that never made it into official files. And in those documents there might be moments where someone wrote the truth, someone who saw the Red Ball Express convoys and understood what they meant, someone who realized that Germany was losing to truck drivers. I wonder if that person felt angry at the injustice of it, whether they felt humiliated that their superior Aryan soldiers were being defeated by men the Nazis considered racially inferior, whether they felt anything at all or just wrote down the facts and filed them away. We will probably never know. Most private papers from that period are lost, but the possibility exists. The possibility that somewhere, buried and forgotten, there is a German soldier's diary with an entry that says something like, "Saw American supply convoy today, counted over 100 trucks, all moving north toward the front. We cannot stop them. We do not have the resources. I think we are going to lose this war, not to their tanks, to their trucks." If that document exists, I want to read it. I want to see the moment when the enemy understood what was killing them. But maybe it does not exist. Maybe no German soldier ever consciously recognized what was happening. Maybe they blamed their own logistics failures or Allied air superiority or a dozen other factors. Maybe they died never knowing that a segregated supply operation, staffed primarily by black drivers, was the invisible blade that cut their army to pieces. That would be fitting in a way. The men who won the battle never got recognition from their own side. Why should they get recognition from the enemy? Everyone missed the point. Everyone looked past the trucks to focus on the tanks and the infantry and the generals. The trucks just kept rolling, unnoticed, unappreciated, essential. I started this story by telling you about German officers laughing at American supply reports in December 1944. Let me end it with a different image. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war is over. Germany has surrendered. Across Europe and America, people are celebrating. In France, a convoy of GMC trucks sits parked on the side of a road near Reims. The drivers are waiting for orders. Nobody has told them what to do now that there is no more front to supply. Some are sleeping in their cabs. Some are playing cards on tailgates. One driver, a young man from Alabama, is writing a letter home. He writes about the surrender. He writes about how strange it feels to not be driving anywhere. Then he writes something that I think captures everything. We won. I still do not quite believe it, but we won. And I keep thinking about all the miles we drove to make it happen, all the nights in the dark, all the roads we thought would kill us, all the times we should have quit, but did not. Nobody will remember that. Nobody will put it in books or make movies about it. But we will remember. The men in these trucks will remember. We know what we did. We know it mattered. That has to be enough. That has to be enough. Except it is not enough. It was never enough. Those men deserved more than memory. They deserved recognition. They deserved gratitude. They deserved a country that valued their contribution. They did not get it. Not during the war. Not after. Some are still alive today. Old men in their 90s, if they survive this long. Most are gone. Their generation is disappearing. Soon there will be nobody left who remembers driving the Red Ball Express. Nobody who felt the steering wheel vibrate. Nobody who counted telephone poles to stay awake. Nobody who delivered ammunition that saved lives. The living memory will die. All that will remain are archives and photographs and stories like this one. Stories that try to resurrect what was lost. Stories that try to give voice to men who were silenced. But stories are not the same as justice. They are better than nothing. They are not enough. You wanted to know what won the Battle of the Bulge. Now you know. It was not Patton's genius. It was not American soldiers' courage. Those things helped. But the battle was won by 6,000 men driving trucks through winter storms. Men who accepted impossible conditions and made them possible through sheer refusal to fail. Men who were black in an army that treated them as inferior while depending on them absolutely. Men who came home to a country that forgot them. The Germans laughed at American logistics. They calculated that Allied supply lines would collapse. They were wrong, not because their math was bad, because they could not imagine an enemy who would push so hard, sacrifice so much, burn out equipment and men to keep supplies flowing. They could not imagine desperation. They could not imagine determination born from being undervalued. They could not imagine the Red Ball Express, and that failure of imagination cost them everything. So here is my question for you. The question this whole story has been building toward. What else do we not know? What other essential contributions to victory have been erased or minimized? Who else won the war? while history was looking somewhere else. The Red Ball Express was hidden in plain sight for 70 years. Thousands of men, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, a logistics operation that changed the course of history, and almost nobody knew about it. If something that big can be forgotten, what else has been forgotten? What other stories are buried in archives waiting for someone to care enough to dig them out? And why should we trust any historical narrative that focuses only on generals and battles while ignoring the people who made those battles possible? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are real questions that demand real answers. Because if we do not understand how wars are actually won, we cannot understand war at all. We are left with myths and legends and patriotic stories that feel good but tell us nothing true. The Red Ball Express forces us to confront uncomfortable truths: racism, exploitation, the gap between official recognition and actual contribution, the way history gets written by people who never drove a truck through enemy fire. Those truths are harder to process than simple hero stories, but they are more important. They show us how things really work, how victories are really achieved, how much gets sacrificed, how much gets forgotten. There is a monument being built, finally. After 80 years, someone decided the Red Ball Express deserves recognition. It is going up in a small park in Fort Eustis, Virginia. Bronze statues of drivers loading trucks, plaques with names, an inscription about their service. It is scheduled to be dedicated next year. Maybe some veterans will still be alive to attend. Maybe they will stand there looking at their younger selves cast in bronze and feel something like vindication. Or maybe they will feel nothing. Maybe it is too late for monuments to matter. I do not know, but I know this: that monument will never capture what those men did. Bronze and stone cannot convey the fear and exhaustion and determination. They cannot show you what it felt like to drive through darkness counting telephone poles. They cannot make you feel the impact of bullets punching through canvas. They cannot give you the weight of knowing that if you stop, soldiers die. Monuments are symbols. They point toward truth. They are not truth itself. The truth is in the archives, in the forgotten reports, in the letters men wrote and never sent, in the memories of old veterans who never talked about what they did because nobody wanted to listen. That is where the real story lives, in the gaps between official history and lived experience, in the silence where recognition should have been. So listen to that silence. Hear what it is telling you. It is telling you that history is not what we remember. History is what we choose to forget. And we have chosen to forget the people who did the hardest work and received the least reward. We have chosen comfortable narratives over complicated truths. We have chosen to celebrate generals who gave orders while ignoring soldiers who followed them. We have chosen myth over reality. The Red Ball Express asks us to make a different choice, to look at what we have ignored, to value what we have dismissed, to recognize that wars are won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things in circumstances that would break most of us. Those drivers were not superheroes. They were men who got in trucks and drove because someone had to drive. And by driving, by refusing to stop, by accepting conditions that should have been unacceptable, they changed history. They saved lives. They won battles. They helped destroy Nazi Germany. Then they came home and loaded warehouse trucks because nobody would hire them as drivers, and most of them died without ever being thanked properly for what they did. That is the story, not the monument, not the speeches, the human truth beneath all the bronze and stone. That is what matters. That is what we cannot afford to forget again.